The interesting thing about Musk, he doesn't think about politics in the way that the tradition of neoliberalism and classical liberalism before it thought about it. Principles of compromise or meeting people halfway would be the exact wrong kind of solution to be coming to, right? If you're an engineer, there are good solutions, and the kind of engineer Musk sees himself. There are good ways of organizing things, and then there are bad ways of organizing things. So your goal is to optimize. And if you approach the social contract, society as a problem of optimization and efficiency, you lose 90% of the history of political thought. And you start speaking a language that normal people find very alienating. And that's, where we are.
I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capitalism, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
For the better part of the 20th century, capitalism has been defined by Fordism, the new organization of production invented by Henry Ford and then exported worldwide. Will the 21st century be defined as the century of Muskism?
According to Quinn Slobodian, professor of international history at Boston University, and his co-author Ben Tarnoff in their new book entitled Muskism, A Guide for the Perplexed, it will be the case. Muskism is not a coherent doctrine articulated by Elon Musk, but rather a pattern of ideas and practices that emerges from his actions, rhetoric, and historical context. In your view, Bethany, what is the defining feature of Muskism?
I think the thing that surprised me the most about it and that I find the most interesting is what they call state symbiosis. The idea is that contrary to the public perception, Musk is not a libertarian at all, at least not in the way most of us think about being a libertarian. He is not seeking to get rid of the government, but rather to use it. Or as they write, the government isn't something to be minimized or eliminated. It can be instrumentalized as a source of power and profit. So the state isn't the enemy. It's not opposition to business. It's a partner, or maybe even something more dependent. At one point, they say the goal is to vassalize the state so that it can only act by purchasing services from private providers. He said this on a podcast. I think it's much more likely that private actors will continue to take on more and more state functions until it's difficult to find the difference between the U.S. state and private Silicon Valley firms. Luigi, what do you think is a defining characteristic?
I think it is the primacy of infrastructure as power. From PayPal to SpaceX, from Starlink to Tesla, Musk rejects the global supply chains, aims for vertical integration, and production becomes a fortress-like self-contained system. Whoever owns the infrastructure sets the rule.
Yeah, I guess it sets up a system of power without democratic constraint, where private actors are the true problem solvers. And in that sense, it's a evolution of ideas we've talked about on the podcast before, in which the government as a problem solver has increasingly become a totally marginalized idea, right? But that makes Muskism, I think, uniquely dangerous in the extent of that belief and the implication that the messiness of democracy, the fact that people aren't just interchangeable variables, is just bad programming, and bad programming should be just fixed or removed, right?
Yeah, so instead of depending on the state, you depend on Musk.
In his previous book, Slobodian explores the successionist tendency of the right. So Musk plays a big role in this space, interestingly enough. Let's talk to Quinn Slobodian and make sense of all of this. There's this definition of Muskism, the belief that civilizational progress should be led by founder-controlled firms operating at planetary scale with democratic institutions relegated to support roles. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I'm not even sure if support roles is the part that needs to be added there at the end. The thing that my co-author Ben Tarnoff and I were trying to get at with the notion of Muskism was, first of all, to break away from the idea of libertarianism as a kind of guiding way of understanding what was going on in Silicon Valley. Certainly by the time all of the Silicon Valley leaders are lined up on the dais behind Trump for his last inauguration, it seemed clear that there was something more like what we call state symbiosis going on. So what kind of state that is, I mean, this is only to respond to the democratic part of the phrase you just mentioned, is, I think, quite open for negotiation. I don't think that there is a core need for democratic validation for the kind of possibilities for profit accumulation and production that they have in mind. So what is it that Muskism entails then? I mean, what are the kind of core things we're arguing? One of the kind of one-line definitions we use is that it's the promise of sovereignty through technology that cashes out as greater dependence on private service providers. You have a kind of promise of what we call electric autonomy through not just the electric vehicle, but really what he calls the Tesla ecosystem, which stretches from solar cells to microgrids to storage units on the wall of your garage to a car which can double as a kind of backup batteries storage, energy storage site, and also in his vision now a site for kind of decentralized computing. You have Starlink and SpaceX, which in different ways offer sovereignty to states as a service through the ability to launch satellites, through surveillance, through battlefield communication, and then more abstractly, but nevertheless importantly, through things like X and AI, he's offering a kind of epistemic sovereignty to clients by saying, here's a service that will, keep at bay intrusive forms of politics and pernicious memes and mind viruses that we promise you have been cleansed from the system which you're buying from us as the Grok chatbot or the AI, XAI, large language model. So it's a relationship to both states and households that has this promise of sovereignty in an ever more uncertain world that is nevertheless falls short of a kind of survivalism or something.
Is this idea, and I can tell already I'm going to struggle with saying this word, is this idea of sovereignty? Sovereignty? I don't know why it's so hard for me. Is that the key thing that distinguishes Muskism from traditional crony capitalism? Because people might say, well, capitalism with hype, state dependence, monopoly power, that's Musk. It's crony capitalism. But do you think that idea is the core distinguishing factor?
One of the things that we ended up having to do in the course of writing this book, especially as people who started out as very deep skeptics and critics of Musk himself, is to have to kind of give him his due at certain points. Normally, I think one would think about crony capitalism would be that it's kind of holding back modernization of certain sectors because there is some kind of patronage networks that, work for people's bottom lines and the enrichment of their insider networks, but it doesn't actually help to bring them to the cutting edge of innovation in this or that sector. One of the interesting things about Musk's products is he actually has been, pushing out the frontier of innovation. SpaceX, since its founding in 2002, has reduced the costs of putting mass into orbit by over 90%. And he did that not just because he, paid a guy off in a back room, but because he actually did do a lot of innovations, vertically integrated the production, stopped relying on outside suppliers, had got a team of engineers around him such that they could solve these hard problems about how to pull off these things from a practical point of view. So insofar as I think crony capitalism has that implication of like the defense of backward technologies for personal reasons of enrichment, it doesn't really seem to fit because the only reason he has been successful is he's made outrageous promises and then partially delivered just enough that investors continue to express their confidence in him.
Yeah, I agree with this view because there's no doubt that Musk has been an enormously successful entrepreneur. And I think the comparison with Ford is probably more appropriate. And this is where I would like to understand the difference because Ford could develop basically independently of the state. Was not a customer for the product, did not really contribute to the creation of the product. Yeah, at the end was sending the troops when there was a labor revolt, but that's about it. Now we are in a world in which the government is an essential component in the business process. Number one, the government creates the fundamental research that enabled this to take place. And number two, the government becomes the major customer. So you cannot dispose of the government, but then they both fear tremendously democracy, but in a sense must fear democracy more because it might undermine his own business model. Democracy did not really mess around with Fordism that much,
No.
but it could really change around the relationship between the state and Musk. And that's the reason why I think they want to dominate the state in a way that is even different from crony capitalism. Crony capitalism is sucking up the milk of the state. Here, no. Here is controlling the state.
Yeah. Yeah, and there is a difference, that a biologist would use between parasitism and symbiosis, and we chose the term symbiosis for a reason, is that there is a kind of exchange that happens in the relationship between Musk and his state customers that is not one way enough that one would start to think of it as parasitical. But to go back to your original comparison between Ford and Musk, it is something we thought about a fair amount. And the interesting difference, too, is that the magic of Fordism, as people understand it, was the way it was able to stabilize the inherently disruptive qualities of capitalism, especially in a period of upheaval and move from one mode to another. How does a new sense of belonging, willingness to cooperate with the employers, a kind of moderation prevail when, based on everything we know about social forces, we should often expect revolts, revolutions, anger, discontent. And Fordism, in that sense, was a kind of model of social peace, right? The way that democracy and capitalism were reconciled in the ways that people now, like Martin Wolf now, retroactively celebrate, was really at the heart of what made Fordism Fordism. What's interesting about Musk, rather than an ideology of social peace, it actually actively seems to be an ideology of social war. So Musk not only is not seeking a kind of equilibrium state or a kind of social calm or compromise of the kind that the mass consumption plus mass production virtuous circle was kind of able to purchase for Ford for a period of time and Fordism for a period of time. But Musk seems to almost require the multiplication of senses of social threat and crisis, right? So in a way, the forward motor of his ideology, and the one that we could associate not just him, but someone like Alexander Karp or Peter Thiel as well, is they actually are not promising intergenerational upward mobility or even really mass prosperity or a higher standard of living. What they're really promising, and this comes through clearly if you read something like the book The Technological Republic, is they're promising security and safety and protection from the pervasive risks that they, spare no verbiage in conjuring up for you as a potential part of this contract. So the move for Musk from the cherry red roadster in the Obama era, which I think was still more of a Fordist product in the sense that it said to Americans, you can go green without really changing much about your lifestyle, right? We can fight climate change while also still having beautiful vehicles in our garages. It might even look nicer. So it was a moment of kind of democratic, still optimism, let's say, about slowing down, maybe even halting climate change. By the time you get to the rollout of the Cybertruck, things look quite different, right? As we talk about in the book, because if you're paying attention, you know that climate change will no longer be stopped and that climate risks will continue to propagate. So the product that Musk is now selling is also kind of tooled to the zeitgeist too, where he's saying, now I'm selling an electric vehicle so that you'll have security when the grid goes down, when the next tornado hits, when the next unexpected blizzard hits in March or April or whatever. So that is also just the tenor of Muskism is different than Ford too, in the sense that it offers protection rather than prosperity. There's also, if I can just add one more thing about the Ford comparison, his relationship to finance is quite interesting to look at and compare to Musk, because the root, in a way, the intercomplementary nature of Ford's anti-Semitism was very much tied into his anti-financism, right? So he believed that Wall Street was out to get him, that the financiers were always trying to defeat him, and that he needed total control partially because East Coast financiers, read Jews in his mind, were trying to undermine his Midwestern ethic of the artisanal workshop, spilled out to the size of the River Rouge plant. Musk also expresses these moments, as do people like Karp, about hatred of short sellers and hatred of those parts of the market that tend not to believe his outsized promises. But he is much more dependent on it than someone like Ford was. Like, he actually needs, right, to be able to go to the Gulf and get capital to help buy Twitter or to help back the new big XAI rollout, spending $1 billion and burning $1 billion a month right now. So this is why, I think stories that have tended to be circulating now, especially on the more tech critical side of the progressive left, about the end game being, the network state or totally privately run cities, either in the Caribbean or the South Pacific, we feel those miss the mark. Because if you want to do the kind of investment at scale that the AI model, for example, requires, you can't do it on an island in the Caribbean. Like, you literally need the conscription of all of the social forces available to make it possible to build out data centers at the size you need, to make credit available at the depth that you need, and to kind of win authorities over to a project that will be transformative, not just for a small number of people, but, as you keep promising your investors, for everyone.
So I wanted to broaden out for a bit just because you invoked Martin Wolf, and we've had him on this podcast, and we too have argued that capitalism and democracy go hand in hand. And it sounds, maybe not necessarily from this book, but from some of your other books, that you more see them maybe as diametrically opposed. And I'm reading into the comments you just said now, but it sounds like from that you see democracy at its best as perhaps keeping the worst elements of capitalism in check. But I'd love for you to articulate what you think about that relationship.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I wouldn't say that I think that they are diametrically opposed, but that they have a very unstable relationship to one another. If you look at the history of the 19th and 20th century, then you see a very halting expansion of what we would think of as democracy, right? Just keeping it narrowly to the idea of suffrage. You could read this as a long-term process of the fumbling towards institutional arrangements within which democracy would not offer an existential threat to the basic premises of a capitalist order, however understood, minimally understood as like a system in which most of the resources are allocated by private means. So the story of my first major book, Globalists, was about this from kind of the 1910s to the 1990s, right? So how did a period in which there could have been many moments where capitalism was unseated altogether, nevertheless keep capitalism as the dominant and eventually the triumphant mode of organizing political economy by the end of the 20th century? And the way that I argued that worked was partially by narrowing the definition of what democracy meant, partially by taking certain decisions out of democratically elected governments' hands that might produce anti-capitalist alternatives, and then in some cases by scaling downward to create sites of investment and the organization of labor that acted as kind of zones of exception from normal democratic oversight or kind of legal accountability. This dance between democracy and capitalism, which is really what characterizes neoliberalism in the 20th century, has been about saying, how do we make these two things work together? The interesting thing about Musk, just taking him as kind of an intellectual figure, it's not a question he really asks himself. He doesn't think about politics in the way that the tradition of neoliberalism and classical liberalism before it thought about it. That tradition was at some level about people in space coming together and forming relationships, either coercively or voluntarily, and then agreeing on a set of binding principles that somehow split the difference between the material needs and interests of everyone adequately, that it would, tumble along for a while until the next paradigm came along. So that would be a way of thinking about the politics from the lived world into something like, let's say, social media, where then people wonder if the public sphere is being tainted or civil society is being hollowed out. Musk and Andreessen and Altman and all of them work from the network out. So they think first about a form of sociability and human connectivity that is online, in which people are primarily, signal sending and receiving nodes in more or less horizontal and decentralized networks. And then working backwards from there, they ask what kind of a society could best serve the primary imperatives of that networked world. And if you work that way, as in that with a really, really severe case of engineering mind, which is what Musk has, then, I mean, not only are you in actually like the worst nightmare of someone like Friedrich Hayek, who saw this kind of utilitarian thinking, Saint-Simonian thinking, mechanistic thinking as like what he was fighting against, but you're also in a place where principles of compromise or meeting people halfway would be the exact wrong kind of solution to be coming to, right? If you're an engineer, there are good solutions, and the kind of engineer Musk sees himself. There are good ways of organizing things, and then there are bad ways of organizing things. So your goal is to optimize. And if you approach the social contract, society as a problem of optimization and efficiency, you lose 90% of the history of political thought, and you start speaking a language that normal people find very alienating. And that's, where we are with someone like Musk, is he speaks in a way that doesn't make sense to most people because most people experience the world in a very different way than he does. If we don't think of ourselves as, non-playing character bots who have chips inserted in our brains that make us act in one way only, and we need to wait around for someone else to insert another chip in our brain, which is quite literally how he understands how most people operate, because we come to our politics through a dynamic interaction with our world and the people around us. And unfortunately, for all of us, that's not the way that he sees things.
To some extent, he seems very much a product of his grandfather. As you know, his grandfather was a leader of the technocratic movement in
Mm-hmm.
Canada
Mm-hmm.
that wanted to replace democracy with a society run by engineers and scientists. So it seems that they're closer to that particular view of the world of the beginning of the 20th century than anything else. No?
Mm-hmm. I think so. I mean, it's an argument we handle with some care in the book because he really only, he only knew him for a couple of years, and even then as really a baby. He died, I think, when he was 4, when Elon Musk was 4. So if those ideas came to him, then it was somehow indirectly, not seemingly through his mother, who is not someone who really entertains this level of kind of philosophizing. So if not that, then there is a kind of elective affinity somehow between their two ways of approaching the world, which I do also find uncannily similar. And even if one doesn't make the claim that it somehow genealogically came from him, then the point still stands, which is it's like a remnant of a moment in the 1930s when people were losing faith in the viability of democracy, and they felt drawn to these mega projects of social transformation that would, render out of service many of the normal veto points of collective discontent and put a lot of power into the hands of a kind of central dictator like engineer. And this is indeed why Fordism was so popular under so many different political conditions in the 1930s. Stefan Lenk is a great historian and wrote a book called Forging Global Fordism. And he describes quite literally how Ford's book, My Life and Work, became a bestseller in the United States, sure, but then also Nazi Germany, also the Soviet Union, fascist Italy. All of these places found it possible to adopt his ideas of kind of top-down rationalization for their own political ends. And it definitely seems that the incredible concentration of power and leverage in the hands of a small number of people that we're living through now has also offered, fertile soil for the sprouting up of that kind of delusionary sense of possibility again, and has also made, enough people persuaded by the incremental kind of material improvements that happen through them buying into these fantasies that it's, in a way, as I began by saying, one of the contenders for a kind of dominant way of organizing the world. We always find it helpful to point out that, one of the top 10 holders of Tesla stock is the Norwegian oil fund. And in Norway, the sale of Teslas fell off by 90% in the last year. And yet, the future of the Norwegian welfare state is very much dependent on people continuing to be persuaded by the fantastical projections of someone like Elon Musk, right? So this is, I think, an important thing that we're trying to draw attention to, that his mania, such as it is also kind of load-bearing infrastructure for the global investment community right now, and will become even more so in a couple of months with the IPO of SpaceX, which he's already set up to fast track into the indexes so that it will immediately then become part of index funds and even more enmeshed, I think, in everyday people who might be very anti-Musk in their personal life, but are now wound up with his fantasy world in intimate ways regardless.
Let's pause on that for a minute, because I've always been fascinated by this distinction between the fraudster and the visionary, and I've argued at times that these characters are actually really quite similar. And this financial fabulism of Musk, how unique do you think that is to him, and how much do you think that is a feature of particularly the American business landscape now, and maybe one that's led by him? In other words, is it Musk's lineage that made Sam Altman possible?
I think he's very much part of a larger cast of characters in this case, right? I mean, as we describe in the Silicon Valley chapter of our book, when he arrives in the Valley in 1995, this was the era when many, young people able to spin plausible yarns were making their fortunes, often on technologies that would either lose money for years or never work at all. So it's something he learned in a milieu of other people doing the same thing. But there is definitely a dynamic in the United States that corresponds to both the importance of venture capital as a kind of part of the investor market, and then, of course, just the retail investor, and then the institutional investor beyond them. They all seem, the venture capital being the sector of finance capital you need to persuade first to be able to get the kind of development money and the seed money that all of these startups require at the beginning of the development of their products before they IPO, before the VCs can exit. There is always going to be a money losing phase, but that is also then interestingly kind of perversely incentivized to correspond to ever greater valuations of how much this company is going to be worth. Because as the VCs manage to value it higher and higher, they're also increasing their payday when the thing finally exits, in the case that it does. It usually doesn't, but only a few have to, as we know by the kind of power law argument that Sebastian Mallaby and others have made. Only a couple need to work to pay for the rest of the failures. So that kind of imperative to exaggerate and to fabulate is, I think, completely structural to the Silicon Valley digital capitalist model. And you won't find anyone who has held their job for long as a CEO who's not willing to go along with that. I mean, it's another thing that's worth pointing out about Musk is so unusual, is how long he's been the CEO of something like Tesla, right? I mean, it's not actually normal for people to remain CEO for like now almost 20 years at that company. So in that sense, he is obviously the most visible kind of indicator species of a certain style of digital capitalism. But I think he is not unique. He's just an exaggerated, or like one of the most flamboyant kind of people in the species.
Speaking of fabulation, so Musk has this obsession with Mars and colonizing Mars. And once I heard Peter Thiel saying that actually Mars is not a technological project, but is a political project, which goes back to the previous discussion we had about maybe creating a separate state or seceding and etc. So how do you see the Mars sort of myth or project within the context of Muskism?
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting one. It's one we definitely struggled with. I mean, it's certainly the case that for someone like Peter Thiel, he's one of the people who's been most on the record, 2009, for example, saying basically we need to exit from democracy in all of its forms. There's really only three places we can build something real and new, which is the internet, outer space, or out in the open seas, seasteading. So it makes sense that Thiel would read Musk's project that way, as really being more about, political experimentation, the creation of new jurisdictions for like ever more distant kind of forum shopping, which is, I'm sure, how Peter Thiel imagines interplanetary settlement. But we kind of think that Musk intends the Mars project politically not so much as a dream of doing politics differently beyond the Earth's orbit, but he uses it as a way to kind of blackmail governments here on Earth. So, one of the things that he's fond of doing is sort of saying, if you don't, sign up to my vision of the future, then you are going to be left behind. And I'm at the forefront, for example, of um, reusable rockets. I'm at the forefront of low Earth orbit satellites. I'm at the forefront of building Starship, the biggest rocket ever built, which ostensibly is for Mars colonization. But if you look at the coverage in the Wall Street Journal, for example, last week, they had a big piece about how Starship is actually going to revolutionize warfare because Starship is not being used, won't be used primarily for going to Mars because the orbits only line up every couple of years anyway. It's kind of a pet project, but it can be used for delivering munitions in ways that keeps the delivery vehicle far out of harm's way from land-based anti-aircraft missile. And the Iran war right now probably shows even more that you don't want to have the normal vulnerabilities of like F-16s and this kind of aircraft. Starship offers what's called the beyond the horizon fleet, basically, where at any moment you can deliver the full payload of the things that you want to your forward operating troops. So that's an example where we think that it would be foolish to take him at his word in this case, to think that he is just doing everything to get to Mars. Rather, the way of framing his intentions as being about Mars actually allows him to produce a bunch more leverage and pressure points on both investors and potential state customers here on Earth. And this, incidentally, we have a piece in The Atlantic that will come out next week pursuing this in relation to SpaceX, because SpaceX and Starlink, again, on paper, why is he doing it? To get to Mars. But what is Starlink actually doing these days? Well, they've just launched Starlink Mobile. So they're beginning to offer direct to cell internet service and cell service. And they are they have filed a request with the FCC to increase the number of satellites in orbit from 14,000 to 1 million, meaning this would be a kind of monopoly position in low Earth orbit for Musk and would potentially be a chance to build out a kind of monopoly on global telecommunications writ large. So there's an example where getting to Mars ends up being about political and economic pursuits here on Earth, much more than the Heinleinian fantasy that he often spins in his shareholders meetings.
To what extent the abundance agenda of Ezra Klein and company isn't just a lighter and maybe kindler version of Muskism? Because Musk has this intolerance for the veto that democracy puts along the way of the
Right.
entrepreneur. And I think that there is a lot of that in Abundance. There's a lot of that in the book Breakneck that has been loved
Dan
by
Wang,
all
yeah.
the venture capitalists and so on and so forth. So what is the relation between the two?
Yeah, we've thought about that as well because the similarity does seem to be there if you just break it down to its core components. I think that it brings up the question of the comparison to China, which is at the heart, obviously, of the Dan Wang book, but also in the Klein and Thompson book. And a lot of what we think of as the emergent Silicon Valley approach to governance could be seen as their attempt to, as they see it, emulate or mimic China. So the way that they understand the Chinese success is that there's been indeed a symbiosis between tech leadership and party leadership that has allowed for a more rational distribution of obligations and resources around the country, and definitely the steamrolling of any question of local dissent or no need to attend to like the nimbius of this or that province because they were never being considered in this model in the first place. So Musk, Thiel, Klein and Thompson, and Dan Wang all are united by this belief that China is kind of a country of engineers, as Wang puts it, and that part of America's problem is it's a country of lawyers. And if it actually wants to achieve these necessary, in some ways, civilization saving technological pushes, then it needs to start being more of an engineer and less of a lawyer. So we've thought about that. And one of the things that Ben and I both find interesting is that, first of all, it doesn't take seriously the extent to which that apparent partnership between tech leaders and political leaders in China is a clear hierarchy in which the tech leaders are in a very subordinated role. The Jack Ma example is only the most obvious sort of demonstration for the rest of the class about what might happen if you at all try to, speak out of class about the party's leadership style. But also, they assume that the problem of the United States is that we have too many laws, too many veto points, too many voices in the grassroots level. But what if the problem with the American capitalist model is that investment is too disorganized, and investment is actually chaotic and not driven by a plan? And, it's investment really, not Nimbius, that produced ridiculous valuations and bubbles around what are ultimately now socially destructive technologies, from TikTok to Meta. TikTok now purchased directly by Trumpist allies. But it seems that the failure to discipline capital is actually the core failing of the United States in its attempt to have a more prosperous, abundant society along Chinese lines, not its submission to an excessive number of, local nonprofits and community activists. So that would be our rebuttal to, I think, all of them who do, I think, they share a certain fetish for that. I mean, one wouldn't want to go too far, right? It's obvious that the discussion about respecting compromise in civil society in many ways is at the core of the abundance agenda, right? It's about trying to deliver on the goals that they think Bidenomics was not able to deliver on, which is to create a virtuous cycle where voters are also seeing the material effects of state industrial policy and investment in their everyday lives, and therefore lending more sympathy to the people in government and putting them back in government and allowing that relationship to expand. So Klein and Thompson have a much more subtle and democratic understanding of how politics works than the program version that I'm saying that the tech leaders do. But I think that unwillingness to discipline capital itself is probably what unites them.
So we're almost out of time, which is a bummer, but I had a last slightly odd question for you. You're clearly a science fiction fan. So Musk and Silicon Valley have taken criticism for some of their illiteracy regarding many classic texts. What do you think? What's your favorite example of something that they got wrong? And just for reference, I was watching Lord of the Rings last night, so I fall into this camp too.
Yeah, well, so it's actually become kind of a popular, like, kind of parlor game in a way to point out the misreadings of people like Musk of science fiction, which is they overlooked, was actually trying to criticize people like them, but they missed the point and thought it was celebrating people like them. I mean, this is best summarized in there are some famous tweets, and this is one of them, right? Where it's like, science fiction writer, I have written a cautionary tale about the torment nexus, Silicon Valley investor, check out my new torment nexus. So that we were almost a bit wary of just reproducing that, because I think there's some ways in which it's a bit of a trap. Like, I think that Peter Thiel talking to a theologian in Salzburg or making reference to this or that philosopher, René Girard or whatever, misleads those of us who are humanists into thinking that that's a way to decode their behavior. and their core motivation. Whereas actually, it's almost more like throwing cookie crumbs over to fool us, to get us off the trail. Like we think that capitalists come to their ideas and ideologies in the practice of being capitalists. They don't, go to work at 6 in the morning and come home at 7 and then read a book before bed and get their ideology from the book before bed, right? They get their ideology from the factory floor, from the ability to persuade investors of the profitability of their company, the ability to win favor with this or that state. So they, interestingly enough, though, and this is the way to answer your question, they find useful science fiction as a kind of reservoir of storytelling, right? As a reservoir of yarns and of speculative projections that then become kind of the raw material for their sales pitch, that become part of the modules that they click together to sell the next big pension fund on the viability of orbital data centers or humanoid robots or whatever the case may be. One of the things that we found interesting thinking about this is that Musk has, through his sequence of successes and his ability to kind of fall forward after every apparent obstacle, basically convinced himself that he's invulnerable and that he needs to follow the logic of science fiction to continue to be successful. And not necessarily Asimov, but very much Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which, if you've read it, it's like someone being swept out of their weird town in northern England and then just like spirited around the galaxy, part of these hijinks. And it's basically just a goofy kind of caper. But what it does have to it at its core is like this kind of zany engine of ironic outcomes where people think something's going to happen and then something else happens. The person who looks like the villain ends up being your friend and so on. And we have speculated that Musk has almost absorbed this idea of not historical materialism, but hysterical materialism, because he's become persuaded, as he puts it, that the funniest outcome is the most likely. And so that in a way, he can, every time he reaches for something more ridiculous, the world congratulates him and rewards him. So he just keeps going. He's like, why would I stop? And that, in some ways, was the puzzle that motivated us at the beginning, is like, how can this, this perpetual motion machine of absurdity end up also accumulating like the largest stockpile of wealth that the world has ever seen in a single individual? Like, that's a pretty intriguing puzzle, actually.
Do I have a time for one last short question?
Sure. One more. Yeah, I have to get my kid.
Yeah. So it turns out that Musk grew up in South Africa. Peter Thiel grew up in South Africa. David Sachs grew up in South Africa. Even you grew up in South Africa, or let's say
South Africa.
Yeah. It seems like in the 20th century, most of the thinkers are coming out of Vienna and the Habsburg Empire. And now most of the thinkers and entrepreneurs seems to come out of South Africa. Is that just a coincidence?
I mean, it could be. If I were to speculate that it's not, I would say that there's something that those two places have in common, which is they're the sites of late empire, right? I think Vienna, what made it interesting, as I argue in Globalists, is you had these people who were trained and socialized to be stewards of this rather large empire, and then the empire was suddenly gone. And so they were forced to reinvent themselves and rethink, what scale does this operate at? Maybe it's the world instead of just the Habsburg Empire. Maybe international law needs to be rewritten, not instead of imperial law. So that being thrust from one, seemingly eternal paradigm into another, quite literally overnight, can, I think, have this sort of pedagogical shock effect and kind of force you to reorient yourself. And apartheid South Africa in the 80s and then into the period of one person, one vote after 1994 experienced that as well, right? I mean, they had this era where they were out of step with the rest of the world. They were a white supremacist, essentially a settler colony left at the bottom of a black continent, a black governed continent by the late 1980s. And then they weren't. And so if you were a child of that place, you needed to somehow reckon with that and figure out where to escape to, what scales to operate instead of the scales you'd been raised at. And for us, one thing we would say is it's not for nothing that people who were raised in that milieu then fantasize so much about kind of frictionless connection and movement and consumption. I mean, one thing I can say as someone who spent some chunk of my childhood there is as a white person who feels like you should be part of a kind of global industrialized North through your socialization somehow, and yet you're not, it really cultivates like a strong sense of yearning for access. And you want to be connected, you're looking for a lifeline, you're clinging on to that magazine that comes down to you from the airport in Heathrow or whatever it is. And that sense, which is not so far from what Leah Upi describes in Albania in her childhood, also then cultivates a strong desire for kind of escape, but also where can you make sure that you'll never have to be, impoverished again. And for Sachs, he has this wonderful line from 1999 or 2000 that we quote in the book where he says, I imagine one day in the future, you'll be able to pull out your phone and order a Starbucks coffee and walk into the cafe and pick it up and pay for it without ever interacting with someone. He says that in the year 2000. It's like, okay. I mean, in that case, they definitely did make the future. You have to hand it to them. Whether it's a future we want is another question.
If you're enjoying the discussions Luigi and I are having on this show, there's another University of Chicago podcast network show you should also check out. It's called Not Another Politics Podcast. Not Another Politics Podcast provides a fresh perspective on the biggest political stories. It's not told through opinions and anecdotes, but rather through rigorous scholarship, massive data sets, and a deep knowledge of theory. So if you want to understand the political science behind the political headlines, then listen to Not Another Politics Podcast, part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network.
I found it pretty compelling, especially the role that financial fabulism plays, because I think I've always tended, probably to a fault, to think of it as Musk being unhinged or misrepresenting the prospects of his companies in order to get capital. But I think there actually is more to it than that. When you see how much it can perpetuate itself, I think that makes me take it more seriously.
You're right, but I have to say the term hysterical materialism is a riot. I think it's a fantastic term and very appropriate for Musk. But a little bit like Trump, I think that this they have in common is they go so extreme that is difficult to take them seriously. As I think, as a commentator say, you don't have to take them literally, but you have to take them seriously. And people take them literally,
Seriously,
and they don't take them seriously.
yes. And I found the idea that this is something that is vying for perhaps the organizing principle of the future to be interesting. I've tended not, I think as a journalist, maybe not to think about these ways in which people have made sense of the world or made sense of the relationship between the state and private actors. And thinking about this as the direction that we're evolving into it's a really interesting framework.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to commend Quinn because coming into it and having read some of his previous books, I thought he was going with a particular frame of mind. But in fact, he is very clear, and in an interview, it was even clearer than in the book. There is no relationship between libertarians and Musk. That Musk is almost at the opposite end of the spectrum as the libertarian. That clarity, I think, is very helpful.
I think so too. For some reason, I may be wrong, but I seem to remember that when we started this podcast many years ago, you were more of a believer, or very much a believer, in the idea that democracy and capitalism were intimately related. But in a sense, Quinn's thinking is also kind of a continuation of the thinking of other people we've spoken to, including Branko Milanovic and others who have argued that no, there's not really necessarily any relationship between the two.
Unfortunately, it sounds like a lawyer, but it's very much a question of definition. If you sort of intend capitalism as simply a way where you have freedom of enterprise and people can get rich, I think there is not necessarily a relationship. If you want a society in which capitalism actually is competitive and deliver to a majority of the people, yes, we need a democratic element. And to me, this is exactly the fracture that we see taking place today, where we see capitalism in the narrower sense flourish at the expense of democracy. But as a result, we don't have a system that actually improves the life of the majority of people. It ends up being quite beneficial only to a small elite.
It's actually fascinating how much all of this is a function of short-termism. And I have been thinking about that because I first encountered the idea of short-termism way back in the days of Enron, and it became this, defining cry of the business world, or at least the corporate governance meetings and panels about how we could get rid of short-termism and make everything more long-term. But the fact that the financial markets have become more and more short-term has actually permeated all of society. And so you have the capitalists only worried about the short-term earnings, yes, but that has pervaded their sense of the world. So they no longer worry about keeping the system safe for capitalism by making sure it's working for everybody, because everything is so short-term that as long as it's working for the next quarter, nobody can even pause to think about what happens to capitalism if it stops working for everybody. Does that make sense? Is that an incredibly banal observation, or does that resonate with you?
Neither. I think that it is not benign, but I disagree. And I disagree
Okay.
for the following reason. It is very much a 1990s view of the world, where you have sort of a GE manufacturing earnings, so they never to disappoint the next quarterly earnings. But think about the world of today, where you have OpenAI. What are the earnings of OpenAI? Did anybody look at the earnings of OpenAI or even Anthropic? Earnings are nothing. All that matters is the long-term success. And two, I don't think that the long term is necessarily such a panacea, because there's this view is, if we only were long-termist, then all the problems would be solved. Of course, there are problems of being short-termist, but I don't think that the only problem of capitalism is people are not long-termist enough.
Okay, I agree with the second part, and that's interesting. I don't agree with the first part, because I think that ability to be long-term oriented applies to a very narrow number of companies and is by very much a subset. And even that subset of companies is on a schedule to deliver, which maybe is appropriate. But I think the companies that it can escape the stricture of the short-term earnings game are very, very few and far between. And they actually, just to bring it full circle or somewhere else, they actually do have CEOs who are financial fabulous and who are able to get the market to believe in the version of the long term that they're articulating.
Absolutely. I think I agree 100% with that. It is fabulous is the opposite of short-term earnings.
Yeah, but it's a very small set of companies. So I think the short-termism applies to most companies.
In terms of numbers, they are very small. But if you multiply by market capitalization,
or by meaningfulness to the American economy, I suppose that's true. That's fair. I also thought it was really interesting, his critique of the thought in abundance. This idea that it's actually the failure to discipline capital, not the fact that we have too many laws. And when you think about things that have gone terribly wrong economically, it has been the failure to discipline capital, right? And so that's, this idea that, well, the private sector wouldn't be pouring all this money into mortgages if made to people who couldn't pay them back if it didn't make economic sense. Well, it didn't make economic sense, and they did do it. Anyway, I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about, maybe we're misdiagnosing the problem, or maybe there are two problems. In other words, you can have a problem of all of these petty laws that are holding back things that should be happening. But this broader idea of disciplining capital. I mean, of course, disciplining capital is antithetical to the notion of the free market, but it's fascinating. Anyway, what did you think when he said that?
No, I love that point. I always thought that one big advantage of China is that China has an alternative source of power, which is the Communist Party. Using that power, you can discipline capital in a way that you cannot. Discipline capital not necessarily in an anti-democratic way. Now, China might do it in an anti-democratic way, but think about imposing antitrust. It's very difficult to do it in a system where companies have so much political power. So the problem of the United States is that there is no source of power alternative than money. And this goes back to the role of democracy, a true democracy where you have the power coming from the consensus of the people, not from how much money you are paid, is an alternative source of power. But in the United States, this representative democracy has been weakened. And so we are into a plutocracy that reinforces the power of money. In China, they have a form of discipline. Now, unfortunately, it's not democratic. And so there are a lot of other problems. So I'm not envying the Chinese system, but I agree with Quinn that the Chinese system as a tool that the United States one has lost.
Capital Isn't is a podcast from the Stiegler Center and the University of Chicago Podcast Network, in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. If you haven't yet, you can now find our podcast as a video on YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. The show is produced by me, Matt Hodap, and Brittany Broders, with production assistance from Andy Nazaro, Matt Lucky, Sebastian Burka, Joey Prepst, and Andy Shee. The podcast is partially supported by a generous contribution from Luis Muniz and Cristani Medeiros Muniz. We are grateful for their commitment to advancing the thoughtful dialogue and scholarly engagement on our show. If you'd like to take the conversation further, also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center, and subscribe to our newsletter. Sign up at chicagobooth.edu/Stiegler.